Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding today in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. Today's daf in the Dirshu Daf Yomi Bahalacha is Kov Zayin Amud Aleph. We're holding in Hilchas Yom Tov, Siman Tov Tzadik Ches, and we are in the middle of Sif Aleph. We're on the top of Kov Zayin Amud Aleph at the words of the Ramah. On the top line, Hagah. Let me just read. I'm going to read from the beginning of Siman Tov Tzadik Ches, from the beginning of Sif Aleph, just so that we recapture what we were up to. So the Mechaber had said yesterday, in the beginning of Sif Aleph, Ein marin sakid lechacham b'yom tov. We do not show a shchita knife to a Talmid Chacham on Yom Tov, lirois im huroi lishchait bay, so that the Talmid Chacham could check the sakin to see if it's kosher for shchita. Why can't we do this? Shematihi paguma, because there's always the possibility that the Rav will find out that the sakin is not sharp enough. It has a paguma, it has a pagima, it has a nick, and it's not kosher for shchita. The Yarmalaya, the Talmid Chacham will tell the shayil, Aser lishchait ba, you're not allowed to use this knife for shchita, mipnei pigimasa, because it has a nick. And then what will happen? V'yelich, the one who's asking the shayla, will go v'yechadedena b'mashchezes, and he will sharpen it with a sharpening stone, and that would be an isser of tikkun kli on Yom Tov. And the Chacham Shara Sakin La'atzmai, the Mechaber said, if someone is a Talmid Chacham in his own right, and he paskins on his knife on his own, and we explain that what this means is the Talmid Chacham who has a knife, even if he has no need for shchita, he doesn't need to shecht anything, but he knows somebody else does have a need for shchita, the Talmid Chacham himself could check his own knife, and we're not worried that he may come to sharpen it if he finds that it's pogum, because he's a Talmid Chacham and he knows the Isser. He knows he's not allowed to. So we're not afraid that he's going to come to be over an Isser. Therefore, he could check his own knife. Even if he has no need for the knife, he could check it so that he could lend it to somebody else so that they should be able to use it. Now let's go to the Ramah. The Ramah says, Hagah, v'achshav bezman hazeh. Nowadays, shakol sheichet roya sakin ba'atzmai, where the accepted minig is that every sheichet checks his own knife, and a sheichet who has Kabbalah on shchita doesn't have to show his knife to a Rav every time and have it paskind on. He could check his own knife. Kol haroitza lishchet b'yom tov. So nowadays we paskin that anyone who wants to shecht on Yom Tov, yivdaik sakinai me erev Yom Tov, he should check his knife on Erev Yom Tov, v'loy b'Yom Tov, and he should not check his sakin on Yom Tov, shema yashchisenu, because we're afraid that he's taka going to come to sharpen the knife. Miyu, however, im loy b'dakay me Erev Yom Tov, if he did not check his knife on Erev Yom Tov, v'hushas atchak, and it's a pressing circumstance where we really have to do shchita, I guess there's nothing for the Sudas Yom Tov, yachal abatka b'Yom Tov, then he is allowed to check the sakin on Yom Tov. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah is cut in hay. The Ramah said nowadays, when every sheichet checks his own knife, and the minig is not to show the knife to a chacham each time, Raya Sakin La'atzmai, says the Chavetz Chaim, why is the sheichet allowed to check his own knife? We know that the sheichet has Kabbalah on shchita. He learned Hilchas Shchita, and he did Shchita in front of a Chacham, and the Chacham taught him how to sharpen the knife and taught him how to check the knife, and the aspiring Sheikhet had to show that he's proficient at checking a knife, and he knows what's a good knife and what's a bad knife, so therefore he could rely on his Kabbalah as a Sheikhet, and he could paskin on his own knife. The Ramah said, Yivdoik sakinai me erev Yom Tov. A sheichet who wants to shecht on Yom Tov should make sure to check his knife on erev Yom Tov. V'lo yachzer hasakin lenadon shaloi. Now, when he checks his knife on erev Yom Tov, after he checks it, he should not slide it back into its sheath. That's what a nadon is. A nadon is the sheath of a knife. Do not put the knife back into its sheath. Why is that? Because if the sharp edge of the blade, or even the sides of the blade, if the nadon is made out of a stiff material, so then when you take the knife and you slide the knife into the sheath, loy mikri su sakin baduk, that is no longer considered a sakin boduk. It's no longer considered a checked sakin that we know is kosher for shchita. When you check the sakin and you know that it's sharp enough, right now it's a sakin boduk. It's a checked sakin, and this sakin was paskined on that it's roi for shchita, and now it's ready to be used, and it does not have to be checked again before it's used. But if you slide it into its sheath, and we know that the blade, the edge of the blade struck, let's say, the leather of the sheath, or even if the side of the blade came into hard contact with the leather of the sheath, that takes away from the chazaka of the sakin. It's no longer considered a sakin baduk, because even the sheath, especially the sheath, can cause a nick in the knife. Even softer things can cause a nick in a knife. I've seen even where water somehow caused a nick in a knife, hard running water. So once it goes into the sheath, it's no longer a sakin baduk. Commercial kasabit to a shar, Siman Yud Ches, Sif Yud Dalet. The kasva achrayim and yachrayim, right? The nachayin, it is proper sheyehei l'chol tabach, that every butcher that does shchita should have shnayim or shloisha sakinim, 2 or 3 shchita knives, bedukim me'erev Yom Tov, that were already checked on erev Yom Tov. That way you're not faced with a crisis that you only had one knife that was checked, and now something happened to the knife, and now suddenly it's a shasat chak, and you have to check a knife on Yom Tov. Have 2 or 3 knives prepared from erev Yom Tov that are checked. V'loi b'Yom Tov, however, the shochet should not check his knife on Yom Tov. Hainu abedika rishona. We know that when we shecht, there are 2 bedikas that you have to do on the knife. You have to do a bedika before you shecht, and then after you shecht, you have to do another bedika. If when you do the second bedika right after shchita, you find out that the sakin is pogum, then the shchita is not a good shchita, because we're afraid that the knife became pogum before the completion of the shchita. So you have to check the knife both before and after the shchita. Now it says the Chavetz Chaim here, when the Ramah says that you cannot check the knife before shchita, you can't check a knife on Yom Tov, he means you can't do the bedika before the shchita. Why? Because if you do the bedika before the shchita and you find out that the knife is pogum, you're going to come to go sharpen it so that you could do shecht, so that you could check. But that's not an issue with the bedika for after the shchita. Because if you do the bedika after the shchita and you find out that the knife is pogum, why should you go ahead now and sharpen it? You already did the shchita. It's already post facto. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, Hainu abedika rishona. Over here, the Ramah is speaking specifically about the bedika before the shchita. Aval abedika shetzarach lasos achar shchita, but the second bedika of the sakin that you do after the shchita, mutter, that's permissible. Because the gzera that you might come to sharpen the knife isn't applicable. Im yimtzena peguma. What are you going to accomplish by checking the knife now? Checking the knife now, you did the shchita, you found the knife to be pogum, now you're going to shecht it. It's not going to render the shchita that you did into a good shchita. It's too late. The Ramah said that if you didn't check the sakin before Yom Tov, and it's a shasat chak, you're allowed to check it on Yom Tov. Chavetz Chaim says a prime example of this would be is you need to shecht, and nobody else in the city has a sakin baduk, so you have no choice. You need to check the knife so that you should be able to shecht. Excuse me. Okay. Siv Beis says the Mechaber, Yachal lahoilich sakin v'habehema eitzel tabach lishchit. Let's say it's Yom Tov and you want to shecht. You're allowed to take a shchita knife and bring it to the tabach, to the butcher who's going to do the shchita. You're also allowed to bring the animal to the butcher so that he can shecht it. Va'afilu gedi katan. This is true even by a small young kid. You have a little baby goat, you're going to have to carry it on your shoulder. It can't walk that far to the butcher, so you're going to have to actually carry it. This is mutter on Yom Tov. And the Mechaber says this is true. Even though you could have transported the animal to the tabach yesterday on Erev Yom Tov, or you could have brought him the Shechita knife on Erev Yom Tov. So why don't you look at this as being machshirei oichel nefesh? Let's get something straight. Bringing the knife to the shaychit is not tzorich oichel nefesh. That's machshirei oichel nefesh. Let's remember, oichel nefesh is cooking. Cooking is a malacha that's mutter because you're doing it with tzorich oichel nefesh. In order to render the food edible, you need to cook it. But sharpening a knife for shchita, let's say, that's not tzorich oichel nefesh. You're not doing it. That's not an act of preparing the food. It's machshirei oichel nefesh. You're sharpening a knife so that there should be a sharp knife available to shecht an animal so that you could cook it on Yom Tov. So that's machshirei oichel nefesh. Machshirei oichel nefesh is not mutter on Yom Tov when it could have been done on Erev Yom Tov. So over here also, you want to carry an animal to the butcher. Well, that's not an act of oichel nefesh. Carrying the animal to the butcher is not going to render it edible, right? So what is it? It's machshirei oichel nefesh. You're doing haitzah on Yom Tov, you're doing malacha on Yom Tov in order to transport the animal to the tabach so that the tabach could shecht it, so that you could cook it and eat it. That's machshirei oichel nefesh. So why is that mutter if you could have done it yesterday? Yet that's what the Mechaber is teaching me here. The Mechaber is telling me, you're allowed to do the malacha of haitzah. You're allowed to transport the knife or the animal to the butcher so that he should shecht it. Even if you mamish have to carry the animal, so it's a full-fledged malacha of haitzah. Even though this is a malacha that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov. And we know machshirei oichel nefesh is also if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Yet over here it's mutter. And the Ramah says, Vahu hadin, and the same halacha applies, the butcher who's going to do shchita, he could take his shchita knife and he could carry it and go to the other side of town and bring it to the guy who wants him to shecht his animal. So he could do haitzah on his knife, even though, again, l'chayra, it's only machshirei oichel nefesh. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. The Mechaber said, you're allowed to transport the sakin v'habehema eitzel tabach. So you could bring the shechita knife and you could bring the animal to the butcher who's going to do the shechita. Va'afilu derech rishus harabim. And you could even do this in the rishus harabim. Ve'ein chayshishin, and we don't concern ourselves, shema yimalech v'lo yishchat v'nimtza dahaitzi shaloi l'tzarech. The first thing the Chavetz Chaim says is that there's a chiddush over here. Why aren't we afraid that you're going to do the malacha of haitzah, you're going to bring the knife to the tabach, or you're going to bring the animal to the tabach, and then when you get there, the tabach is going to feel the animal, and he's going to say, you sure you want me to shecht this animal? This is a pretty skinny animal. Now, at that point, if you change your mind and you decide that you're not shechting the animal, so now it turns out that you did a malacha of haitzah on Yom Tov that wasn't a tzarich oichel nefesh at all. You never went ahead and used the animal for oichel nefesh. So l'chayr, you did a malacha of haitzah on Yom Tov completely shaloi l'tzarich. So says the Chavetz Chaim, that's what the Mechaber is teaching me here. The Mechaber is telling me, ain't chayshishin. We don't worry about that. Then the Mechaber said, let's take a look at Eis Kat and Yud, that this is mutter v'afal pi shehaya efsher. These malachas of haitzah, the haitzah of taking the animal to the tabach or bringing the knife to the tabach, are mutter, even though they could have been done on Erev Yom Tov. And the Chavetz Chaim explains why. He says, the haitzah ba'oichel nefesh, the malacha of haitzah, when it's done l'tzarech oichel nefesh, ketikun oichel nefesh atzmai dami, it's considered tzarech oichel nefesh itself, the loy kimachshirin. It's not considered machshirei oichel nefesh. Now this is very, very interesting. But first, before we explain it, let's just see what the Chavetz Chaim is saying. I told you we have a problem over here. Why is it mutter to do the haitzah for oichel nefesh? L'chayr, it's not oichel nefesh. It's machshirei oichel nefesh. And if it's machshirei oichel nefesh, it should only be mutter if it's something that was not able to be done before Yom Tov. But Haitzah, transporting the knife or the animal to the Tabach, l'chayra, could have been done on Erev Yom Tov. So if it's Makshirei Oichel Nefesh, why is it mutter on Yom Tov, even though you could have done it before Yom Tov? And the answer the Chavetz Chaim says is, because we have a very interesting halacha. When it comes to the malacha of Haitzah, we look at the act of Haitzah as being Tzarich Oichel Nefesh itself, and not Makshirei Oichel Nefesh. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says, therefore, ein chilik bein efsher miba'od yom oiloi. So, if it's Tzarich Oichel Nefesh itself, then there is no difference between if you were able to do it yesterday or not. The halacha is that Tzarich Oichel Nefesh you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, even if you were able to do it yesterday. So, since we're treating Haitzah as Oichel Nefesh itself, and not as Makshirei Oichel Nefesh, it makes no difference if you could have done it yesterday or not. And the Chavetz Chaim says even more. Even according to the Yesh Machmirim, to the stringent opinions that we saw earlier in Tav Tzadik Hey, who hold that while it's true, Me'ikar Adin, that by Tzarich Oichel Nefesh itself, there's no difference whether it's something you could have done before Yom Tov or not. There's a Yesh Machmirin that says if the malacha that you want to do l'tzarich oichel nefesh is something that there would be absolutely no loss to Yom Tov at all if you would have done it yesterday, then we should be machmir. If it's something that the food is not going to taste as good, so like the Mishnah Berurah told us earlier in Tav Tzadik Hey, if you want to bake bread on Yom Tov, so there's no question that fresh bread is better than day-old bread. So we're going to be matter you to bake bread on Yom Tov, because even though efsher you could have baked the bread on Erev Yom Tov, but everybody knows that fresh bread is better than one-day-old bread. So on Yom Tov you're not mechuyev to have one-day-old bread. No, but if it's a malacha where there's no cost to Yom Tov at all, if you would have done it on Erev Yom Tov, so do it on Erev Yom Tov. Why are you doing it on Yom Tov? So there's a Yesh Machmirin that the Ramah brought down in Tav Tzadik Hey, and the Ramah said that we go with that Yesh Machmirin that says if there's no cost to Yom Tov at all, you should be Machmir. So l'chara over here, when it comes to the Malacha of Haitzah, you would say, is there any cost to Yom Tov if I bring the knife to the Tabach on Erev Yom Tov? Or I bring the animal to the Tabach on Erev Yom Tov? Is the food going to taste any worse? So maybe we should be Machmir. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. Even according to the Yesh Machmirin in Tav Tzadik Hey, Le'inyan Haitzah ein lahachmir. When it comes to Haitzah, there's no reason to be Machmir at all. So there are two items over here, I would say, here in Sifkat and Yud, that need explanation. The first one is, why is it that when it comes to the Malacha of Haitzah, we treat the Malacha of Haitzah as being Oichel Nefesh itself and not Machshirei Oichel Nefesh? So again, by something like sharpening a knife, so we call that Machshirei Oichel Nefesh. The Malacha of sharpening the knife, the Malacha of Tikkun Kli, Tikkun Mana, of sharpening the knife, that's not an act of Oichel Nefesh. That's a preparatory step. You need to sharpen the knife so you could check. That's Machshirei Oichel Nefesh. It's not Oichel Nefesh itself. And Machshirei Oichel Nefesh, we say, is only mutter on Yom Tov if it's something that you could not have done before Yom Tov. But if you could have done it before Yom Tov, it's not mutter on Yom Tov. Yet by Haitzah, we say that even though the act of Haitzah, l'chayra, is Machshirei Oichel Nefesh, bringing the animal to the Tabach is not an act of Oichel Nefesh, it's only Machshirei Oichel Nefesh. Yet the Chavetz Chaim told us over here that when it comes to Haitzah, we treat it as Oichel Nefesh itself, not as Machshirei Oichel Nefesh. Why is that? So there's a very fascinating Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer says that the reason is as follows. And again, let's use these two examples. Yeah, let's use the example of sharpening a knife and the example of transporting the knife to the Tabach. When you sharpen a knife, you're doing a malacha of Tikkun Kli. What is the object of the malacha? What's the chayfetz of the malacha? It's the knife. You're doing a malacha to the knife. Now, doing a malacha to the knife, is that an act of Oichel Nefesh? No. You're not being misakin the knife to eat the knife. So you're doing a malacha to a knife so that you should have a knife so that you could check an animal for Oichel Nefesh. So that's machshirei oichel nefesh. It's a malacha that you're doing as a preparatory step towards the goal of oichel nefesh. Now, how about hoitzah, when you bring a knife to the tabach? The animal that needs to be geschachten is by the tabach. You have the knife. You're doing hoitzah, and you're transporting the knife to the tabach. Well, over there, are you doing a malacha to the knife? Are you somehow changing the knife? Are you performing an act on the knife? No, you're not doing anything to the knife. It's true that the object that you're transporting is the knife. You're doing the act of hoitzah on the knife, but you're not doing anything to the knife. The malacha of hoitzah that you're doing, if I wanted to try to encapsulate it in a nutshell, what you're doing is you're bringing the knife close to the animal so that the animal should be able to be shechted. You're also causing the animal to be closer to the knife. How are you causing the animal to be closer to the knife? By bringing the knife to the animal, you're causing the animal to be closer to the knife. So in a sense, you could say that the object of the malacha is also the animal. It's not only the knife, it's the animal too. Let's understand that when we speak about malacha on Shabbos and Yom Tov, we know the golden rule is that for a malacha to be aser, you need meleches machasheves. You need to be doing a malacha for a purpose, for a definable purpose. The purpose of the malacha of hoitzah over here is to be mekarev the behema and the sakin, to bring the behema and the knife close to each other. So in a sense, you could say that the object of the malacha is the animal the same way the object of the malacha is the knife. And therefore, if it's a malacha that's being done with the animal, then it's oichel nefesh. And that's why we could look at the hoitzah as being an act of oichel nefesh itself, not as machshirei oichel nefesh. That's in a nutshell what the Avnei Nezer says. Oh, that's the first thing that needs explanation in Sif Yud, in Ois Katan Yud. The second thing that needs explanation is that the Chavetz Chaim tells us, even according to the Yesh Machmirim in Tav Tzadikei, that says that if there's a malacha that could have been done on Erev Yom Tov with absolutely no cost to Yom Tov itself, then even if the malacha is a mamish tzarech oichel nefesh, and we're saying over here now that hoitzah is considered mamish oichel nefesh, not machshiri oichel nefesh, but if there's no cost to Yom Tov at all, so we should be machmer, we should do it on Yom Tov, on Erev Yom Tov. But the Chavetz Chaim says that does not apply to hoitzah. Why doesn't it apply to hoitzah? The answer seems to be because hoitzah is what's called the malacha gerua. What does it mean it's a malacha gerua? In one sense, it means that it's not such a powerful malacha. In other words, what are you doing? You're transporting something. You're not changing something. You're not affecting a change in an object. What you're doing is you're moving something. It's like my son put it in a very interesting way. He said, when you buy something from Amazon, there's two different charges. There's the payment that you pay for the item. That's the actual purchase. And then there's shipping. Shipping is a separate thing. It's not considered part so much of the etzem transaction. It's a peripheral part of the transaction. So too, hoitzah is a little bit of a malacha gerua. Now, excuse me. Because hoitzah has this sort of status of being a malacha gerua, the halacha is that by hoitzah we say mitoich. Mitoich is, we say, mitoich shehutra l'tzorich. Since it's a malacha that we were mater for it, tzorich, hutra nami shaloi l'tzorich. It's also mutter, even shaloi l'tzorich. As long as there's some tzorich yom tov, we're mater. So by hoitzah, there's no point in being machmir, because we say mitoich. There's an interesting Rambam. The lashon of the Rambam is, the reason we say mitoich by hoitzah is because if we would aser hoitzah totally on Yom Tov, it would be maneh simchas Yom Tov. Yom Tov, midaraisa on Yom Tov, there's an inyan of simcha. V'samachta b'chagecha. We need simcha on Yom Tov. And the way the Rambam puts it is, if somebody would have to sit v'yadav asurais, He can't carry anything, and he can't bring over dessert when he goes over to his family, to his friend for the Suda. He can't bring a nice bottle of wine. He can't bring the machzer. He can't do this. He can't do that. That would be a big mania in Simchas Yom Tov. And that's why by Hitzah we say mitach. Ayis cutting it off. You could transport the knife to where the behema is. Even though if the animal is in one place and the knife is in another place, sometimes there's a very easy way to get away from the malach of Hitzah. Let the animal walk over to where the knife is. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no, there's no need to do that. L'chatchila, you could go transport the knife to where the animal is. Siv Gimel. Says the Mechaber. Let's say you have animals that go out on their own, they go to pasture outside of the tchum. And then sometimes they come back and they sleep inside the tchum. So these animals, all on their own, they go out of the tchum and they come back into the tchum. So you might think that there's a problem of using these on Yom Tov. Maybe they were out of the tchum. Maybe they're no longer considered muchan for Yom Tov use. Maybe they're muktzah. Says the Mechaber, no. Harei elu muchanois. Since they do come back into the tchum on Yom Tov on their own, so they're considered muchan for Yom Tov use, because you know that these animals are in the habit of coming back. And therefore you could take from these animals, and you're allowed to go ahead and shech them on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut in Yud Beis, ubayis v'lanais. These animals come back and they sleep in the yishuv within the tchum. Lav dafka b'chol yom. This doesn't mean that they necessarily come back every day. Ela afilu shebaim laprokum lalun nami. Even if they only sometimes, not sometimes, leprokim, every now and then they come back. Still, nami muchanois hein min astam u'ketilakame. Still, the default position is that they are considered muchan for Yom Tov use. And therefore, as cut Yud Gimel v'loichid mehem, you're allowed to take from these animals. Va'afilu loy bo'u miba'od yom ela b'layla. Even if they didn't show up before Yom Tov, even if they came back into the tchum and they showed up on Yom Tov itself, still you're allowed to take them. Imrak les behu iser tchumin kigan shaboam aleim v'chadayma. This is only true if they came on their own into the tchum. If you brought it into the tchum, that wouldn't be the halacha. If you brought it from outside the tchum into the tchum on Yom Tov, you aren't allowed to do that. Then you're not allowed to use it. But if it came in by itself, there's no iser tchumin, no problem. Why is this okay? And says the Chavetz Chaim, this is true even though the lechashav alayu klal ben hashmasha is nami mutar. So these animals didn't show up before Yom Tov. They only showed up on Yom Tov. So your mamash didn't think about them before Yom Tov. You didn't think about them at the time of ben hashmashas. They weren't here. Still they're mutter. Why? Because these are considered animals that live in the house that you automatically your das is on them. And you didn't have to have specific das on those animals. Since these animals are in the habit of always coming back into the tchum, so that's considered that the default is that you had in mind if you want to use these animals for your Yom Tov meal, you're going to use them. Continues the Mechaber, Avol haroyos v'halonos chutz l'tchum, but animals that pasture and sleep outside of the tchum, in bo b'Yom Tov, if they happen to show up on Yom Tov, ein sheich denaisan b'Yom Tov, you're not allowed to shech them on Yom Tov, mipnei shehin muktzin, because those are muktzah. Ve'ein das anshe ir aleihen, and the people of the city didn't have default das on those animals. These are not animals that you had any expectation to see on Yom Tov at all. These are not animals that come into the tchum and sleep in the tchum. They generally stay out of the tchum. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Yadalit, v'alon is chutz l'tchum. Hainu, this means shedarkom liyos royes kolakayitz ad chodesh cheshvan v'achakach b'is lebeisam. We're talking about animals that usually for the entire summer season, all the way until cheshvan, they always stay outside the tchum. So then the default position is that your das is not on these animals. So if one happens to show up, it's muktzah. So from the entire summer season until Cheshvan, a person doesn't have his das on these animals. He doesn't expect to see them. And therefore the muktzah. Valkain and Bo, and therefore the Mechaber says, if they happen to show up, you're not allowed to take from them. You're not allowed to check them. They're muktzah. Tezvav, in Bo b'yomtiv, if they happen to show up on yomtiv, umayri delespu is a trumin, kigoin shabo me'alei me'ervu la'isay tzad, oile inin lahater isam liYisrael acher. And again, we're talking over here where there is no isser of tchum. There's no isser of tchum because the animal walked into the tchum all by itself, or you made an erev, so it was always within the tchum. You did a ruve tchumen. Or you're thinking that even though there is an Isser Tchumen, a Yid went and brought it into the Tchum illicitly, he wasn't supposed to, but the halacha is if a Yid brings something in from outside the Tchum, a different Yid is allowed to use it. So maybe you would think you want to be matter it for him. Says the Mechaber, no, you can't, because they're muktzah. Ein shaychten, Tezayin ein shaychten, because they're muktzah. Uleman deshari muktzah, b'yontav mutarim. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, again, we go back to Taf Tzadikei Dalet. According to the Shita that was brought down by the Ramah, the more kuladik Shita in Muktzah on Yom Tov, who holds that we're Mekel in Muktzah on Yom Tov the same way we're Mekel on Shabbos, by something that theoretically has a use on Yom Tov. So according to them, these would be mutter. These would not be Muktzah. These would not be Muktzah. Because if you're makel in muktzah, so these animals, they're not like groigrois or tzimukim. They're not something that you are madche biyodayim. They're not something that are not roi for use. They are something that's roi for use. You didn't have das on them, but if it showed up, so it showed up. So it's not muktzah if you're makel. So according to the Shittas that are Mekel on Muktzah, these wouldn't be Muktzah. But the Chavetz Chaim says, but there are Shittas that are Machmer and say that even according to the more kuladik Shittas, these would be Muktzah. Because since the bottom line is that there's zero expectation of seeing these animals within the Tchum during the summer, they are like raisins. They're like dried figs and raisins that you took up to the roof to dry. So you are matche them biyodayim, and you know that when you put them on the roof to dry out, at the beginning of the drying process, they become not royal achila. So you're mamish mesiach das from them. So too over here, there are shittas that hold that these animals, since they never come into the tchum during the summer, you're mamish mesiach das from them, and even according to the mokula dikashittas and muktzah and yomtiv, there would be muktzah v'chamavur le'el b'simin shin yud. We're going to stop over here because I'm up against my Tehillim share, so I got to stop over here. We'll pick up tomorrow 2 lines from the bottom by Vahani Mili. Okay, for those of you that are interested, I'm about to Zoom a Tehillim share. I'll try to send out a text with the Zoom numbers. The schus of Liman HaTorah should stand Gans Klal Yisrael in good stead, and the Rebbeinu Shalom should send the Bias Gal Tzedek B'Mehera V'Yameinu. Thank you for joining me for Liman HaTorah.